In this video, I'm going to try my best to explain the concept of Western civilization within the context of Percy Jackson, examine whether it's a harmful concept or not, and if it is handled well in the series. And I think it's best to start with a quote from the first book of the series, The Lightning Thief, where Charon explains the existence of the Greek gods in the modern world to the main character, Percy. Come now, Percy, what do you call Western civilization? Do you think it is just an abstract concept? No, it's a living force, a collective consciousness that has burned bright for thousands of years. The fire started in Greece, then as you well know, the heart of the fire moved to Rome, and so did the gods. Or different names perhaps, but the same forces, the same gods. And then they died. Died? No. Did the West die? The gods simply moved. To Germany, to France, to Spain for a while. Wherever the flame was brightest, the gods were there. They spent several centuries in England. All you need to do is look at the architecture. Every place they have ruled for the last 3,000 years, you can see them in paintings, in statues, on the most important buildings. So that is Rick Riordan's explanation of Western civilization in The Lightning Thief, and it sums it up pretty well, but it doesn't quite cover everything. Wikipedia's explanation is the heritage of social norms, ethical values, traditional customs, belief systems, political systems, artifacts and technologies of the Western world. Western values become the symbols of dominant mentality for the culture of Western societies that transcended through power and authority. The term applies beyond Europe to countries and cultures whose histories are strongly connected to Europe by immigration, colonization or influence. Western culture is most strongly influenced by Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christian culture. So now that we have the definition nailed down, I'm going to move away from the context of the book for a moment, and look at why the concept of the West, or Western civilization, is in my opinion harmful. First off, I will admit there is some truth behind the idea. For example, Greek philosophy has influenced modern philosophy greatly, but then again so has Chinese philosophy and Arab philosophy. The reality is that every culture throughout history was influenced or is influenced by cultures that came before them or cultures that they lived alongside. And the modern West is no different. It's influenced in many different ways by cultures all over the world. And there are plenty of Greek and Roman ideals that the modern West has chosen not to adopt, like slavery or the oppression of women. So while some ideals like democracy have carried through, not everything the Greek and Romans came up with has stood the test of time. And you today, influenced by your education and the world you live in, are a very different person from the average Greek 2,500 years ago. In his book Guns, Germs and Steel, Jared Diamond explains the reason why the Europeans were so successful at dominating the entire world was because of environmental differences, and not out of any sort of intellectual, moral, or inherent genetic superiority. So ideals such as democracy and free speech are not really specific to the so-called West, but they are simply a result of human development over time, and the West had a significant head start. The idea of the West gained more prominence in the Cold War, where the US wanted to distinguish themselves from the spread of communism and define their identity. This resulted in the clash of these two powerful ideologies in less developed parts of the world, proxy wars, which ironically held back developments in these affected countries. I would argue that the ideals the so-called West holds so dear are not ideals specific to the West, but ideals all of humanity should be striving for. It just so happens through environmental factors that the Europeans were first to industrialize, exploit other cultures through colonialism, get rich, and be able to promote ideals like democracy and freedom of speech, ending up more socially and economically developed. Now do not misunderstand me, more developed does not mean superior culture. And also the so-called West should not force the rest of the world to accept these ideals, even if they are something like democracy, because it never works. The basic conclusions I draw from all of this is that the concept of Western civilization has some element of truth but is slightly flawed, and the concept of the West is fundamentally flawed and outdated. And also, geographically, the idea of the West makes no sense. West of what? Does it include Australia and New Zealand? Because they seem pretty southeast to me if you're comparing it to the West. As you can probably tell by now, it's a very confusing, complex discussion, so let's move back to Percy Jackson. So I have established why the concept of Western civilization is harmful, but is the way it is presented in Percy Jackson harmful? Well, it does serve a very good narrative purpose. It explains why the gods exist in Percy's world, and explores the interesting idea of gods living on in the collective consciousness of human minds. And if we go back to the explanation in The Lightning Thief I quoted earlier, I think it can be interpreted in multiple ways. It can be interpreted as European American superiority, with all-powerful gods as mascots, but it can also be interpreted simply as a way of explaining ancient Greek influence across history, on, say, the Renaissance and American architecture. Additionally, in Rick Riordan's later books, I think he leans away from the first interpretation. A good example is in the Kane Chronicles. Apart from a new pantheon coexisting alongside the established Greek gods, in The Serpent's Shadow, Sadie asks Walt how a regular modern man has entered the Egyptian afterlife. The afterlife looks different to every soul, depending on what they believe. For that guy, Egypt must have made a strong impression. Maybe he read the stories when he was young. And if someone doesn't believe in any afterlife, then that's what they experience. So this is a very interesting idea in and of itself, but for the purposes of this video it basically says that different cultures' beliefs coexist alongside each other harmoniously. And throughout his books, Riordan promotes many different cultures and mythologies, which of course is really good. So I do not think in the slightest Rick Riordan is trying to promote a harmful idea of Western civilization. What I'm really interested to see is how they will handle this in the upcoming Percy Jackson Disney Plus series. Whether they will change it to emphasize this idea of harmonious belief systems, or whether they will stick to the Western civilization line. Oh, and there's some really good videos I recommend you watch if you want to learn more about these concepts of the West and Western civilization. I'll put them in the cards and the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.